At first glance, U.S. national parks are natural temples that preserve the majesty of mountains, the silence of deserts, and the freshness of forests. Millions of tourists come here every year for inspiration, peace, and adventure. But there are those for whom these places are more than just a dot on the map. It's a zone of responsibility, a territory where every disturbance, every footprint, every rustle can be a danger signal. This is the world of the rangers. Their work is almost invisible to most. They don't seek fame, they don't give interviews, they don't pose in front of waterfalls. But they are the first to be there when tourists disappear among the white dunes of New Mexico, when trespassing in an Alaskan valley, or when the sultry canyons of Utah smell of chemistry that has nothing to do with nature. Juan Menddees, Logan Crowe, Elias Gray, Tess, Travis Watson. Everyone has their own story, their own pain, and their own path. Some are searching for the truth about the death of loved ones. Some are trying to escape from war. Some are trying to escape from themselves. They have one thing in common. At the most critical moment, they did not turn away. These stories are not just about investigations, disappearances, and mysteries. They are about the fragility of the human psyche, about loneliness in silent landscapes, about the courage to see what others would rather not see, and the price to pay for the truth. Ranger Tess Wells' report of the 17th of July, 1976, reads succinctly, "Traces of chemical contamination detected at Source 16B, Mays District." The next day, she requested a 3-day leave of absence for personal reasons, and when she returned to duty, she brought with her evidence that eventually uncovered one of Utah's largest drug rings. Tess Wells didn't set out to become a ranger. The daughter of a police detective from Moab, she chose a career as an investigative journalist. Her articles on corruption and drug trafficking in Utah earned her several awards and a lot of trouble. Everything changed after the death of her father. Detective James Wells was found in his car with a stopped heart in 1972. The official version was a heart attack. After years of fruitless attempts to continue her father's investigations through journalism, Tess joined the Canyonlands National Park Service in 1976. The Mays District, the most remote and dangerous section of the park, known for its labyrinthine canyons and extreme temperatures, became her new home. No one questioned why a journalist with a promising career suddenly decided to become a ranger in a forgotten corner of Utah. And that was to Tess's advantage. The fewer questions, the better. She wanted to forget the past and make a fresh start. July 1976 was exceptionally hot, even by desert standards. The thermometer read up to 38 degrees in the shade, and in the canyons of the Mays, the temperature rose even higher. Tess was just completing a routine check of the water sources when she learnt of the missing hiker. Paul Carter, an experienced hiker from Colorado, had disappeared without a trace on his third day in Mays. His camp was found untouched, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. The search operation had been going on for a week with no results. Tess had no way of knowing that Carter's disappearance and her own investigation would soon intersect in a most unexpected way, and that in 3 days she would have to choose between following protocol and uncovering the truth she'd been searching for 4 years. The smell of ammonia in the desert is never natural. To Tess Wells, that smell at the water source meant only one thing: human intervention, and it wasn't touristy. Her detective father had taught her to recognize such signs. The Mays area of Canyonlands National Park was virtually deserted in July 1976. Only the most experienced hikers ventured deep into its tangled canyons. Daytime temperatures exceeded 38 degrees Celsius, and at night dropped to 15 degrees, a drop that was dangerous even for trained travelers. The morning of the 17th of July began for Tess with another patrol. Source 16B was one of the most remote, located in a narrow canyon with little sunlight. Tess had prepared thoroughly. Her rucksack was stocked with water, food, navigation equipment, and a walkie-talkie, although communications in the canyons were often interrupted. When she reached the spring around noon, she immediately noticed something strange. The rocks around the spring had a whitish scum on them, uncharacteristic of natural deposits. The air was saturated with a chemical odor that contrasted sharply with the usual desert scents. Tess took samples of the water and sediment. Her journalistic instincts told her this was no accidental contamination. Ammonia, acetone, maybe even iodine, familiar signs. As she documented her find, the uncomfortable feeling of being watched never left her. Several times she interrupted her work and peered into the shadows of the canyon. Finished with her samples, Tess began to methodically explore the area around the spring. At the 10th meter, she found the first clear sign of human presence, a barely visible trail leading up the eastern wall of the canyon. Not the hiking trail marked on the maps, but a narrow strip of crumpled soil and displaced rocks. She estimated that the climb led to the upper tier of the canyon, where several caves, too small to attract tourists, were marked on the maps. Overcoming the heat, Tess began a cautious ascent. The higher she climbed, the more distinct the chemical odor became. 30 meters above the spring, the trail curved around a rocky ledge. Around the corner, a narrow vertical rift was visible in what appeared to be a solid wall. As she drew closer, she saw that it was wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The stone floor in front of the entrance bore the telltale signs of human presence: worn sand, cigarette butts, and most disturbing of all, drops of liquid that left the same whitish residue as the source. Tess took pictures of all the details and tried to contact the base, but the radio gave only static. Her first instinct was to look into the crevice, but professional caution took over. She didn't know what might be inside and wasn't prepared for a potential confrontation. Having taken the last of the photographs, Tess was about to descend when a rustling sound was heard in the depths of the crevice. She instinctively ducked behind a rock ledge, her heart racing. The sound didn't come again, but her whole body tensed in anticipation of danger. The minutes dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Finally, deciding that the noise might have been caused by a fallen rock, she cautiously peered out. The entrance looked the same as before. Tess began her rapid descent, looking back and listening often. When she reached a safe point, she contacted the base, limiting herself to a brief message about the water contamination. Not a word about her suspicions, or that it might be related to her father's case. Lab analysis of the samples confirmed it. The water contained chemicals used in the manufacture of methamphetamine. This was no longer a simple violation of park rules. It was a criminal offense. Protocol required reporting to a supervisor, who would then contact local authorities. But after her father's death, Tess didn't trust the local police or even some of her colleagues in park administration. In her official report, she stated only the facts about the contamination, omitting the trail and the crevasse. During the night, Tess lay awake most of the night, pondering her next move. There was one person she could trust, Ray Martinez, an FBI agent from Salt Lake City, with whom she had once worked on a corruption story. Bypassing management to contact the FBI was a serious breach of protocol that could lead to dismissal, but much more was at stake. The chance to uncover the truth about his father's death and stop drug trafficking through the national park. The rule of thumb for Canyonlands rangers is to always go through official channels. But after her father's death, Tess had forgotten how to trust the system. For 4 years, she tried to find the truth and got nothing but rejection letters and closed doors. Tess called Ray Martinez, a former colleague of her father's, now an FBI agent in Salt Lake City. He was one of the few who also doubted the official version of Detective Wells' death. Briefly and without preamble, she reported her discovery at Mays and its possible connection to her father's case. Martinez could not come before 2 days, but urged her to wait for him, advice Tess was going to ignore. On the 18th of July, Tess requested a day off. Her plan was simple: return to the cave, but better prepared. Her backpack contained the standard ranger's kit, a powerful torch, a chemical vapor mask, and her father's pistol. Tess wasn't looking for a confrontation, but her instinct for self-preservation wouldn't allow her to go unarmed. She took a detour to the canyon, using her personal motorbike instead of the conspicuous company jeep. After an hour of watching, making sure there were no people present, Tess descended to the spring and climbed up the hidden trail to the crevice. This time she didn't hesitate. Squeezing through the narrow passage, Tess moved through the tunnel, which gradually widened. The air was saturated with a chemical odor, and she put on her mask. After 50 meters and a sharp turn, Tess found herself in a spacious cave. What she saw surprised her. The room was almost empty. The floor showed the marks of recently moved heavy equipment. The walls were lined with fixtures for ventilation pipes, and there were a few canisters and cardboard boxes against the far wall. Empty plastic containers with chemical labels were lying in the corner. Everything indicated that some equipment had recently been dismantled here. She deduced from the arrangement of fixtures and remnants of tubing that one of the ventilation shafts did indeed exit directly above the source of 16B, explaining the chemical contamination of the water. In the far corner of the cave was a small hiding place, a niche hollowed out in the rock and covered with stone. Inside was a tattered map of the park with markings, a new notebook with dates and numbers, and several photographs of the canyons with coordinates on the back. One of the markings on the map was circled in red and marked with today's date, the 18th of July, 1976. The West Ridge area, about 5 kilometers from Tess's current position. Flipping through the pages of her notebook, she came across a list of names. Most told her nothing, but one made her heart beat faster. W. Reed, Victor Reed, Moab's chief of police at the time of her father's death. The man who had officially closed the investigation into Detective Wells's death as natural. Tess continued to look around the cave and soon discovered something strange. Notches on the wall that looked like coding or a cipher. Next to them was the inscription J.W., the initials of her father, James Wells, and the year of his death. It couldn't be a coincidence. Suddenly, voices were heard outside. Tess extinguished the lantern and took cover behind a rock ledge. 2 men with lanterns entered the cave. They were looking around the room and discussing something about the effectiveness of the last move. From their conversation, Tess realized that the group regularly changed the location of their lab, moving between different maze caves, an ideal strategy for avoiding detection. They left the cave. As soon as the footsteps died down, Tess stepped cautiously out of hiding. She quickly but carefully left the cave the way she had come in. Already on the path down to the canyon, Tess felt the ground shake. When she looked back, she saw dust rising from the crevice. It looked like there had been a collapse in the cave. Intentional or accidental, it could have buried the remaining evidence and evidence of her visit. Reaching the motorbike, Tess unfolded the confiscated map. The red marker pointed to the area known to the rangers as West Ridge, one of the most inaccessible and rarely patrolled sections of maze. Judging by the markings, the drug traffickers used at least 5 different locations, cycling their equipment between them. Analyzing the findings, Tess began to understand the pattern. The group appeared to have been working in the park for years, perhaps since the early 1970s, when her father had started investigating. They moved the mobile lab between remote caves every few weeks, leaving a minimum of footprints. For normal patrols, such a system was virtually elusive. But what did his father's initials in the cave mean? Had he discovered their operation shortly before his death? And what role had Victor Reed played? Tess knew one thing: the answers could be waiting for her on the West Ridge, where, judging by the red marker, the drug traffickers had moved their lab. In the cramped cave with limited oxygen and a collapsed exit, Tess looked through the drug cartel's files. On the last page of the report, she saw a signature. The handwriting belonged to a man she'd known since childhood, her father's former partner, and now Moab's police chief. The Western Ridge greeted Tess with a pre-dawn chill. On the 19th of July, she arrived before sunrise, carefully parking her motorbike in a natural hiding place among the rocks. The military binoculars she'd inherited from her father were her main tool. From a safe distance, she could observe the coordinates marked on the map. The first 2 hours of observations were inconclusive, but as the sun rose above the horizon, Tess noticed movement near one of the rock formations. 2 men emerged from the almost invisible cave entrance, climbed into a nearby parked pickup truck, and drove off toward the main road. They returned another hour later with packages and canisters. Tess recorded key evidence, canisters, burners, notes, on a camera with a telephoto lens. She needed hard evidence, not emotion and conjecture. By midday, she had enough images to confirm activity in the cave, but she needed to wait until nightfall to be sure. As dusk fell, there was more activity at the cave. A second car arrived, a black SUV with tinted windows. Tess held her breath as 3 men in business suits got out, one of whom was Victor Reed. Even from a distance, his large figure and distinctive gait were unrecognizable. It was the last confirmation Tess needed. The former Moab police chief who had closed the case of her father's death had personally visited the drug lab in a remote part of the park. She took a series of pictures, paying particular attention to faces and license plates. Waiting until Reed's SUV left the car park around midnight, Tess cautiously descended from her observation position and headed for her motorbike. She had a clear plan. Deliver the evidence immediately to Agent Martinez, who was due to arrive in Moab in the morning. In a motel on the outskirts of Moab, Tess had been preparing a detailed report until dawn. In addition to the photos, she had a map of all 5 locations of the mobile lab, the chemical evidence she'd found, and most importantly, circumstantial evidence of Reed's involvement in her father's death. Not enough for a murder charge, but more than enough for a search and arrest warrant in a drug case. Martinez arrived at 7 a.m., just after a tiring overnight flight from Salt Lake City. Despite his fatigue, he scrutinized all the materials Tess had presented, making notes and nodding occasionally. The experienced agent quickly appreciated the significance of the find. "This is very serious, Tess. You did a great job," Martinez said as he looked through the photos, "especially these shots of Reed. We suspected him of having ties to drug traffickers, but until now we had no direct evidence." Martinez immediately contacted the FBI's Salt Lake City regional office and started the process of obtaining warrants. Tess was surprised at the speed with which the gears of the federal investigation were turning. By noon, the operation was fully planned, and by evening, the agents were already arriving in small groups, staying in various motels in Moab to maintain secrecy. Martinez had insisted that Tess not participate in the raid itself. "You've already done your part of the job, and quite a bit," he said. "Now it's our responsibility." Tess understood his logic, but she couldn't just sit and wait. They came to a compromise. She would stay at the operations command center, helping with navigation and knowledge of the area, but would not go to the scene of the arrest. The raid began at dawn on the 20th of July. 3 teams of FBI agents, backed up by rangers and local police, carefully selected by officers not affiliated with Reed, moved simultaneously toward the West Ridge. Tess watched the coordination from a temporary command post set up in the ranger's office. The operation had gone almost flawlessly. 6 workers and 2 guards were detained at the lab. Equipment, chemicals, and most importantly, documentation were confiscated. At the same time, another group of agents searched Victor Reed's house in Moab and arrested him on charges of organizing drug production. In Reed's personal safe, agents found key clues: a shabby diary with entries from 1972 that mentioned Detective Wells's name and the mysterious M protocol, as well as a vial containing the residue of a rare poison that causes heart attack symptoms. The date of the last entry coincided exactly with the day Tess's father died. A cache found in one of the lab walls revealed complete documentation of the relocation system: dates, locations, cave plans, names of those responsible. The cartel had been operating in Canyonlands for over 5 years, regularly changing production sites to avoid detection by regular ranger patrols. On the wall of the main cave behind the chemical warehouse, Martinez found something that definitively linked the past to the present. Carved into the stone were the initials JW and a barely visible date: June 1972, a week before Detective Wells died. Her father had actually found one of the labs and left his mark, his last signature before his death. When Martinez showed Tess a photograph of this find, she finally felt that the years-long search had come to an end. Her father didn't die of a heart attack. He was murdered for getting too close to the truth. And now, 4 years later, his daughter has completed the work he started. October colored the Canyonlands cliffs an even richer shade of red. Tess Wells stood atop island in the sky, watching the setting sun turn the horizon golden. It had been 3 months since the West Ridge operation that had changed everything. The drug cartel trial was still going on. Victor Reed and 11 other defendants awaited sentencing. There was enough evidence not only to charge them with drug production and distribution, but also to reopen the investigation into the death of Detective James Wells. After the case was solved, Tess was offered a return to journalism. Several major publications were interested in her story, but she declined. Working as a ranger in Canyonlands became more than just a way for her to escape her past. She fell in love with the wilderness, its rugged beauty, and the secrets hidden in the stone labyrinths. Tess was transferred to the park's education department. She now trained new rangers, focusing on recognizing signs of illegal activity and security protocols in remote areas. The mobile drug lab system uncovered through her investigation became a showcase case for National Park Service rangers across the country. Rangers now knew what to look for when checking remote caves and canyons. One mystery, however, remained unsolved. The disappearance of hiker Paul Carter, the starting point of the investigation, had no explanation. Neither in the cartel's documents nor in the testimonies of the arrested drug traffickers was there any mention of him. His traces were lost in maze in the summer of 1976, as if the desert had swallowed him up without a trace. Canyonlands National Park holds its secrets, and some of them may never be fully revealed. But thanks to one ranger's determination, at least one dark page of its history has been closed and justice has been served. On the 21st of July, 1978, Elias Gray, a 45-year-old ranger, discovered unusual tracks near the eastern end of the Valley of 10,000 Smokies. The tracks did not belong to bears or any other known animal in the park. They led to a small crevice in the rock, from which a slight noise came. Near the entrance lay a metal fragment with a partially legible inscription. Elias picked up the find and tucked it into his uniform pocket. Until 1976, Elias had worked as a private detective in Seattle, specializing in finding missing people. His career was cut short after a tragedy. In December 1975, his wife Laura was found dead in the woods near the city. The official version read, an accident, an attack by a wild animal. But Elias suspected a connection to his latest investigation, where he dug up information about corrupt officials. There was no proof, and 6 months of fruitless search for the truth had broken him. In July 1976, he accepted a position as a ranger in Katmai, one of the most remote national parks in the United States, a place where volcanoes neighbor the largest population of brown bears, and the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, formed by a 1912 eruption, resembles another planet. The radio transmitter on Elias's belt suddenly came to life. Gray, answer the base. We have an emergency. 2 German tourists are missing from your sector. Last seen yesterday at the entrance to the valley. Contact base immediately. Over. Elias looked at the metal chip in his hand, then at the dark entrance to the crevice. There shouldn't be any machinery in his sector. He'd finally found some peace during his 2 years in the park, but now he felt a familiar chill along his spine, the same one that in Seattle always signaled the beginning of a dangerous investigation. On the 22nd of July, 1978, an empty camping tent stood on a flat spot in the southern part of the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Elias Gray methodically surveyed the scene, noting every detail. The German couple, Anna Weber and Lucas Hoffmann, had disappeared between the evening of the 20th and the morning of the 21st of July. Their last check call to the park's base was at 7:40 p.m. on the 20th of July. Inside the tent was a mess. Sleeping bags unzipped, personal belongings scattered. An expensive camera with a broken lens lay by the entrance. Elias checked it. There was no memory card. There were drops of blood on the tarpaulin floor. 50 meters from the tent, the ranger found car tire tracks. clear tread prints in the soft, volcanic ash. Vehicles are forbidden in this part of the park, except for emergency services, which have not traveled here for the last 2 months. Elias took photos and measurements of the tread. The tread pattern was unusual, not standard for Park Service vehicles. The tracks went northeast, toward the less visited part of the valley, where the activity of fumaroles, volcanic gas outcrops, made it difficult to travel and survey the area. At 2:30 p.m., the ranger found himself in the village of King Salmon, 40 kilometers from the park boundary. Here he met Tess, a 72-year-old hunter from the Athabascan people. The old man was known among the rangers for his intimate knowledge of the terrain. Tess listened to Elias and, after a moment's silence, told him that twice in recent weeks he had seen strange animal behavior in the area of the northern fumaroles. Bears were avoiding the salmon-rich rivers near the valley, and birds were avoiding parts of the lowlands, though there was no apparent reason for this. 3 years ago, in 1975, a hunter from Anchorage disappeared in the same area, Tess added. The authorities said it was an accident, but we didn't find a body. Bears don't do that. They leave traces of their meal. Elias jotted down the information in his notebook. Details about the hunter's disappearance might be in the park's archives. Strange that he hadn't heard about this incident before. Back at the base at 1745, Elias requested data on the vehicles that had entered the park in the past fortnight. Only standard tour buses and a few private vehicles with camping passes in authorized areas, far from where the couple had disappeared, were listed. At 7:20 p.m., the ranger checked the records for the disappearance of the hunter mentioned by Tess. A brief description remained on file. James Harris, age 41, reportedly drowned while crossing the Yukok River on the 15th of August 1975. No body was found. The Yukok River flowed 2 kilometers from where the hikers now disappeared. Elias spread the metal fragment he'd found on the table and examined it under a magnifying glass. The fragment looked like part of some industrial device, perhaps a pump or a generator. The partially preserved inscription could have been part of a company name or equipment model. At 8:15 p.m., the phone rang. It was the Anchorage Police Department. The missing hikers' belongings contained the contacts of relatives in Germany who had already been notified of the incident. The family insisted on searching, promising to fly in 3 days. At 22:30, Elias returned to his hut. By the light of the desk lamp, he scrutinized the map of the valley. If the tire tracks went northeast, they probably led to old geological stations abandoned in the 1960s. The area was considered dangerous because of unstable ground and toxic gas emissions, so regular patrols didn't look there. On the morning of the 23rd of July, Elias prepared the equipment for the survey of the northern fumaroles: gas mask, special suit, measuring devices for determining the composition of the air. In his rucksack, he put a 2-day supply of food, water, flares, and medicines. He informed the park management about the planned route. At 8:15, he left on a service all-terrain vehicle to the border of the no-go zone, then continued on foot, following the tire tracks. By noon, the tracks led him to a small canyon where volcanic gases normally accumulated. Here, the prints abruptly stopped, as if the car had vanished into thin air. Examining the rocky walls of the canyon, Elias noticed fresh scratches in the rock, as if something heavy had struck the stone. Climbing higher, he found a hidden passage, a narrow crevice narrow enough for a small vehicle to pass through. The entrance was camouflaged with moss and artificially attached rocks. Inside the passage, the ranger found a scrap of paper with the Raven Creek prospecting logo and the date December 7th, 1978. 10 days ago. The name of the company didn't tell him anything. Advancing down the narrow corridor, Elias heard a distant mechanical noise. The sound, completely out of place in the wilderness of the reserve, echoed off the walls. An engine? A generator? A drilling rig? Whatever it was working right now, hidden deep within the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. The ranger switched off the torch and moved toward the sound, treading with extreme caution. The tunnel gradually widened, turning into an adit, clearly man-made. The walls showed signs of recent rock working. A faint light glimmered ahead. Suddenly the sound stopped. There was silence, broken only by the dripping of water somewhere in the depths of the tunnel. And then Elias heard voices. Human voices, coming closer to where he was. Elias froze. Two men were discussing a shipment of equipment and some Lester. Accidentally hitting a rock, the ranger gave away his presence. "Who's here?" A harsh voice was heard, accompanied by the sound of a trigger being cocked. The ranger started to retreat towards the exit, but hurt his ankle in the darkness. A shot rang out behind him. The bullet struck the rock next to his head. Elias fired a flare into the tunnel, temporarily blinding his pursuer, and made his way out despite his injury. "We have a problem. There was a stranger in the tunnel. Looks like a ranger," came the words from the adit. With a broken radio, a damaged leg, and surrounded by poisonous gases, Elias realized he couldn't get very far. Feeling dizzy from the pain and toxic fumes, he lost consciousness. On July 24th, a rescue helicopter found Elias unconscious 2 kilometers from the suspected adit site. His notebook, camera, and metal fragment had disappeared. It seems he lost them along the way. The search team did not find the adit he described. The traces were destroyed by the night downpour. Without evidence, park management classified the incident as an accident. Elias spent 2 months in an Anchorage hospital. After returning to Katmai, he was restricted from administrative work due to his injury. By December 1978, the search for the hikers had officially ended. The story of the underground mine remained only in Elias's memories, which no one believed, but the ranger wasn't about to give up. Even chained to his office chair, he began to gather information. Slowly, methodically, as he had once done in Seattle. Someone had to answer for the disappearance of 2 innocent tourists, and for what was going on in the depths of the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. The 25th of April, 1980. Elias Gray was perusing the morning paper in the cafe. The television was reporting on the eruption of Mount St. Helens, a news item that piqued the ranger's professional interest. A lot had changed in the intervening 2 years since the incident in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. The breach happened in March. In the photo from the ceremony of issuing new mining licenses, Elias noticed a man with a crow tattooed on his neck, among the representatives of Horizon Mining Logistics. The company was actively expanding operations in western Alaska. Posing as a potential investor, Elias visited Horizon's office. He then followed the tattooed man to a warehouse complex. There, the ranger noticed crates of equipment with Raven Creek written underneath the Horizon sticker. On the 27th of April, Elias met with journalist Paul Reed of the Anchorage Daily News. "Sounds interesting, but where's the proof?" Paul asked. "The connection between the missing hikers and this company seems strained." Elias showed the photos taken outside the warehouse and a diagram of the possible connections. Horizon Mining was founded in 1979, a year after the Katmai incident, the ranger explained. But their founder, Marvin Lester, was previously in the small gold mining business. Raven Creek was his underground operation, which he legalized under a new name. Suppose so. But even if the company was mining illegally in the reserve, where's the connection to the disappearance of the tourists? Paul asked. "They could have filmed something. Remember, the memory card from the camera disappeared," replied Elias. By early May, Paul had gathered information about Horizon. The company had made an impressive leap to become an influential player in the Alaskan mining industry. Lester's unclear source of startup capital was suspicious. On May 15th, they checked Horizon's office in King Salmon, just 50 kilometers from Katmai. The office was closed, but a local salesman said employees periodically go on expeditions towards the park. "They say they are doing geological exploration with permission from the administration," he added. "But the strange thing is that they always arrive one way and leave another." On the 20th of May, an anonymous letter arrived to the editor with a picture of Lester shaking hands with a high-ranking official. The caption read, "Meeting after obtaining license to develop Site 37, August 1978. Paul phoned Elias. "Site 37. Could it be related to that entrance 37 you heard about in the tunnel?" "License obtained in August 1978, just a month after the tourist disappeared," Elias remarked. "Too convenient a coincidence." The next day, Paul published an article about possible irregularities in the issuing of licenses to mining companies. The reaction was lightning fast. The editorial board was flooded with threats of lawsuits. On the 25th of May, Elias noticed surveillance. A black SUV, which looked like the car of the man with the tattoo, followed him and tried to run him off the road. The next day, Paul was suspended from the investigation, and the collected materials were confiscated by newsroom management. "They're afraid of losing advertisers," the journalist explained. "I'm sorry, but I have to stop cooperating." On the 2nd of June, Elias received a letter from the Katmai administration demanding that he return to work and refrain from actions that are reputationally damaging to the Park Service. That same evening, his flat was broken into. All of the investigation materials disappeared. The police registered the case as a domestic burglary. On the 10th of June, the ranger returned to administrative work in the park. Externally, he discontinued the investigation. Management noted his return to professional duties, but in the evenings, in the quiet of his office, Elias began a new investigation, more cautious and deeply conspiratorial. He realized he faced a serious adversary with influence and resources, no physical evidence, only encrypted notes in a personal diary, no direct contact, only anonymous inquiries through trusted contacts, no suspicious travel, only careful analysis of available data. The ranger was preparing for the long game. It might take years, but he intended to solve the mystery of Anna and Lucas's disappearance and stop illegal operations in the park he'd sworn to protect. Rain drummed on the window of Elias Gray's office in Katmai Park. On the desk was a fresh newspaper clipping. Horizon Mining Logistics announces major contract with federal government, and a shabby folder labeled Case 37. Over 4 years of undercover investigation, Elias has built up a detailed archive hidden in a cache beneath the floorboards of his cabin. But there was still no direct evidence of a link between Horizon and the disappearance of the tourists 6 years ago. A phone call interrupted his musings. "Elias? It's Jim from the Land Department. Horizon has applied for a license extension. They want to include the northern sector where you found the camper tent in a 78. Why now, 6 years later?" On the 19th of June, in the Anchorage City Archives, Elias found the answer. A geological survey report on a large gold deposit in the northern part of the valley. The document was classified until 1983. Now Horizon was in a hurry to get the development rights. In the evening, the ranger spotted the stakeout, a dark sedan with tinted windows. Waiting for him in his motel room was an envelope with a photo of the missing hikers and the inscription on the back. "Jack Cowan knows the truth. The 21st of June, Hammond Creek Base." Jack Cowan is a former fellow ranger who quit in 1979. Rumor has it he took a job with a private company. On the 21st of June, Elias entered the Hammond Creek Base, 70 kilometers from the park boundary. Hiding behind a stack of pipes, he spotted Cowan exiting the administration building and heading toward the utility rooms. Following him, Elias found himself in an empty hangar where he discovered a camouflaged hatch in the floor. Hiding behind some crates, he soon saw Cowan and Marvin Lester, the founder of Horizon, going up in the lift. "The final decision will be tomorrow," Lester was saying. "The police have closed their case. 6 years, no trace. Nobody's going to dig into the tourist story again." "What about evidence?" Cowan asked. "They'll be destroyed by tomorrow morning. Entrance 37 will be sealed forever. No one will ever know what happened to those Germans." After waiting for them to leave, Elias went down the technical shaft to the underground level. Among the archive cabinets, he found a file cabinet called Project Chronology, with documents dating back to 1977. An entry dated the 22nd of July 1978 read, "Intruder Incident, Elimination of a Security Threat to the Project." There were also photos from the memory card of a tourist camera. Anna and Lucas had accidentally filmed the camouflaged adit entrance and equipment. Suddenly, an alarm went off. Elias, fleeing from the guards, crept down the ventilation shaft to the surface and disappeared under the cover of darkness and rain. The 22nd of June, 9:30 a.m. Elias gave copies of the documents to the Attorney General's office, the FBI, and Deutsche Welle, and the family of the missing hikers. At 10:15 a.m., as the ceremonial meeting was beginning in Horizon's office, FBI agents entered the building with a search warrant. Lester, Cowan, and 3 other executives were arrested on charges of illegal resource extraction and involvement in the disappearance of the hikers. On the 24th of June, an investigative team discovered entrance 37 inches in the valley, a disguised entrance to underground tunnels. Anna and Lucas's personal belongings were found deep inside the complex. No bodies were found, but bloodstains in the adit belonged to the tourists. The investigation revealed that Raven Creek, then Horizon Mining, had been illegally mining gold for 6 years through underground adits connected to natural volcanic cavities. Tourists accidentally discovered the entrance and were killed to cover up the operation. Jack Cowan, who decided to cooperate with the investigation, admitted that he knew about the murder and helped cover up the trail all these years. On the 5th of July, 1984, Elias stood at the plaque erected in honor of Anna and Lucas on the valley viewpoint. Justice had been served, but the price had been high. The 15th of October, 1986. The first snow covered the Valley of 10,000 Smokes with a white blanket, hiding the scars left by man and nature. Elias Gray walked slowly up the slope to the observation deck, leaning on his cane, a consequence of an old injury and the events of 2 years ago. A lot had changed in the 2 years since the Horizon Mining expose. The federal investigation culminated in a high-profile trial. Marvin Lester received 25 years in prison for organizing illegal mining and being involved in the murder of tourists. Jack Cowan, who agreed to cooperate with the investigation, served a reduced 10-year sentence. The uncovering of a corruption network led to the resignation of 3 high-ranking officials. Katmai National Park received additional funding and increased protection from the encroachment of mining companies. Elias reached the top of the slope and looked out over the valley that stretched to the horizon. Nature had all but hidden the traces of human intervention. Where entrance 37 had been, there was now only a natural rock formation. Now, in his position as Chief Conservation Officer of the park, he had the opportunity to prevent similar disturbances in the future. The newly introduced volcanic activity monitoring system also made it possible to monitor any unauthorized entry into the area. Life went on. Elias no longer felt the weight of unfulfilled duty. The ghosts of the past had not disappeared completely, but he had learnt to live in peace with them. The coming snow covered the footprints, but it did not erase the memory, neither of the dead nor of the justice that had been served, however belatedly. A group of hikers appeared in the distance, heading for the observation deck. Elias adjusted his ranger badge and walked toward them. His duty to the dead was done. Now it was time to serve the living. In the depths of the Grand Canyon, heat kills faster than thirst. 7 minutes without shelter in the blazing summer sun and your skin starts to burn. 2 hours and heat stroke sets in. 6 hours and your organs fail one by one. In this scorcher, a family with 2 small children has been gone for 30 hours. Max Wallace once guided people into the most dangerous corners of the canyon for money. Now he does it to save lives. One wrong move in his past cost the life of an innocent man. He can't afford a second mistake like that. The problem is that the children are missing exactly where not only the sacred relics of the Indians are hidden, but also the secrets of Max himself. And someone from his past knows how to use both. For nearly 5 hours, Max Wallace searched for signs of life in the relentless desert. The navigational GPS on his wrist read 43 degrees, the hottest day this summer. The air shook over the hot sand and the red canyon walls seemed to melt under the blazing sun. It was almost unbearable for an unaccustomed person to be here. For children, it was deadly. The sound of a radio broke the silence of the desert. The dispatcher of the South Edge station reported what Max had already feared. the situation with the missing Taylor family was becoming critical. The last contact with them had been recorded last night at 7:30 p.m. on the Nankoweap Trail. The coordinates of their last mobile activity were immediately sent to his GPS. Max clenched his teeth at the mention of Nankoweap, one of the most isolated places in the canyon he knew all too well, and not just as a ranger. All search and rescue teams were involved in a major incident involving a busload of tourists on the West Rim. The operation to rescue the family had been assigned to him, the best tracker, and the only one who knew the Nankoweap area so well. Chief Ranger Jenkins didn't know why Max had learnt the trails so well. This mystery had remained his burden for 15 years. Max wrote down information about the missing men. John, 42, history teacher; Lisa, 40, accountant. The children are Emma, 10, and Tyler, 8. A family with average physical fitness, standard camping gear, and 3 days' worth of water supplies. A quick calculation confirmed his fears. They were going to run out of water this morning. In this heat, they had no more than 24 hours without water. With the automatic movements of an experienced ranger, Max double-checked his equipment: first aid kit, 6 liters of water, flares, firearms on his belt under his jacket. The GPS showed it was 14 kilometers to the Nankoweap Trail. In an off-road vehicle, it would take about an hour. On the way to the ranger jeep, the face of a young soldier, Ryan, who had died under his command in Afghanistan, flashed through his mind. Max remembered every feature of his face, every freckle, the moment when life had faded in his eyes. Now, instead of Ryan, he saw the face of 8-year-old Tyler, the boy who could die in the canyon if Max didn't make it in time. "Not this time," his lips said wordlessly. The jeep left a puff of dust behind it as it traveled over the rough dirt road. Max realized that in an hour, his past and present would converge in a place he hoped never to see again. Nankoweap, a place that held not only the ancient secrets of the Hopi tribe, but also the secrets of Max Wallace himself. Moving along the winding road amid the parched landscape, he remembered the Marines' training. The only way to beat the heat is to remember that it beats everyone equally. The key is to endure a minute longer than your opponent. Today his adversary was not only the canyon, but his own past. At the turnoff to the beginning of the Nankoweap Trail, a lone man stood at the lookout. Old Joe, a Navajo man, the caretaker of this part of the park, the only local who knew of Max's past. His tattered hat barely protected his wrinkled face from the blazing sun. In his eyes, Max sensed anxiety. He switched off the engine and got out of the jeep. The heat came over him like an invisible wall. Old Joe didn't say a word, but handed him a worn leather amulet. Such amulets were worn by the guards of the sacred places of the Hopi tribe. Max understood the meaning of the sign at once. They had come for the mask, a spiritual relic hidden in the ancient barns of Nankoweap. The ghosts of his past had returned, and now not only his family's lives were at stake, but also his own redemption. "15 years ago, Max Wallace was 22, and he had no ranger's badge, no military bearing, no conscience to torment him at night. There was only a talent for finding his way where others saw only endless red rocks, and a knowledge of the canyon imbibed from childhood. His grandfather was one of the first rangers of the Grand Canyon, and every summer little Max spent here learning every trail, every cave, and every bend of the mighty Colorado River. When at 19, Max decided not to go to college, but to stay in Arizona and become a guide, no one in the family was surprised. But no one imagined that he would use his talent not to lead groups with cameras, but to accompany those who were hunting for Native American treasure. That morning, Max led a group of 3 men. Jake Harris is a 35-year-old artifact hunter with degrees in archaeology and anthropology, who preferred quick profits to years of digging. His partner Rick is a large man with constantly sweaty palms and a nervous look. And Professor Martin, a quiet expert on Hopi culture whose thirst for knowledge proved stronger than academic ethics. The Nankoweap Trail was dangerous even for experienced hikers. It was one of the most isolated and inaccessible trails in the entire park. No drinking water, no shelters, no cell phone service. The perfect place for those who wanted to go unnoticed. Their target was an ancient Hopi barn carved into the rock more than 800 years ago. Legend has it that masks used in sacred ceremonies to summon rain were stored there. Each such mask could fetch up to $500,000 on the black market, and Jake knew a collector willing to pay double that for a particular specimen, a Kachina rain mask. Max didn't ask questions. His job was to lead in and lead out. For $20,000, he was willing to overlook the pickaxes and special solutions for cleaning rock art in his clients' backpacks. Moving along the bottom of the canyon, the group reached a place where ancient Hopi builders used natural depressions in the rock. The stone barns, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding rocks to the untrained eye, had held their secrets for centuries. Jake went to work immediately, methodically examining the walls for a hiding place. The day was drawing towards evening when Professor Martin noticed an unnatural hollow behind a large boulder. Inside was a small niche sealed with clay, covered with symbols centuries old. Max sat on a rock off to the side, studying a map of the next route. Motorbikes roared to life. 3 men in ranger uniforms appeared from around the bend in the canyon, but Max knew immediately that these were not real park rangers. They were Big Tony's men, Jake's rival in the search for artifacts. Events were unfolding rapidly. Rick reached for his gun, but before he could even touch the holster, the first shot echoed through the canyon. The bullet hit Rick in the stomach. Professor Martin panicked and dashed behind a boulder, where he was hit by the rockfall caused by the second shot. Jake pushed Max into the crevice at that moment, jumping in after him. Bullets clattered on the rocks above their heads. They were trapped, but safe for now. Max would never forget the words Jake had whispered then. "I have 2 choices. Shoot myself or go out and surrender. There's no third. You have 1 more. I'll distract them. And you make a choice about what you want to be." And Jake leapt out of cover with his hands up, shouting something about money and a deal. While his attacker's attention was on him, Max crawled to the edge of the cliff and started down the nearly vertical wall. He had spent his entire childhood in the Grand Canyon. He knew every ledge and every handhold. Shots rang out from behind. Someone screamed. Max's palms bled from the sharp rocks. Clinging desperately to the canyon wall, he swore at that moment that if he survived, he would never bring treasure hunters here again, and that no one else would die because of his choices. When the exhausted Max walked to the river a few hours later, he didn't yet know that his promise would be broken 15 years later, and that Jake Harris, who had survived that gunfight, would never forget how Max Wallace had abandoned him to save his life. The Nankoweap Trail began like most Grand Canyon trails, with a steep descent where every step was painful to the knees. But experienced hikers knew that the real challenge begins only after the first kilometer downhill, when the comfortable trail turns into a barely perceptible strip around steep cliffs. Max moved quickly, absorbing information with all the skill of a former tracker. The soft soles of the Taylor family's trainers left distinctive marks in the reddish dust. Judging by the depth of the prints, they walked quietly, without hurry. The children were frolicking, darting in and out of the main path, where their parents had apparently allowed them to go. A normal, happy family, unaware of the danger. The trail disappeared about 3 kilometers from the start of the trail, near the first steep bend where the canyon opens up in all its majestic beauty. Tourists often stopped here for photos and rest. Max squatted down, studying the disturbed rocks. One of them showed a fresh chip with a metallic glow. He pulled out a pocket knife and carefully pried up the tiny fragment of metal. Paint, dark green, from a military-style sapper spatula. Max surveyed the surrounding area, methodically dividing it into sectors as he'd been taught in the Marines. In a crevice 10 meters from the path, he found a wrapper from an energy bar, not a tourist one, but a military one, from Army rations. There was no doubt. This was not just a group of lost hikers. This was a planned kidnapping. Max's insides clenched. The kids. They'd taken the kids, and he knew why. The Nankoweap Trail led to a sacred Hopi site, an ancient granite and ruin where, according to legend, ceremonial masks were kept for the ritual of summoning rain. For the desert-dwelling Hopi tribe, rain was the most precious gift of the gods. Their masks, steeped in centuries-old rituals and prayers, were considered more than just objects of art. They were receptacles of spirits. Max stood up and looked at the ominous red wall of the canyon. If his calculations were correct, he had at most 6 hours to find the family alive. The sun was mercilessly approaching its zenith, scorching all life. By evening, the temperature would drop to a tolerable 30 degrees, but that would be too late for the dehydrated men. He moved along the tiny, almost invisible signs that other rangers would have missed: slightly shifted rocks, a broken cactus branch, the distinctive pattern of disturbed soil. The kidnappers were not following the main trail, but a parallel, lesser-known trail that led to the hidden entrance to the Nankoweap caves, the trail Jake Harris had shown him 15 years ago. A small crevice, almost invisible to the casual observer, led to a maze of narrow passages within the rock. Max knew that without a torch or experience, anyone could get lost there and die in the dark, but the kidnappers clearly knew where they were going. Before entering the crevasse, Max checked his gun. The Glock was as reliable as ever. The professional part of his mind reminded him of protocol. Call for backup. Don't enter a potentially dangerous area alone. But there were no reinforcements, and the family was running out of time. In the shadows, at the very entrance to the cave, lay a small backpack with the image of a superhero, Tyler's backpack, dropped or deliberately left here. Inside, Max found a notebook of children's drawings and a water bottle, almost full. It was a sign. The kidnappers were deliberately showing that they had the boy, and he was still alive. Max illuminated the first meters of the cave with a torch. Rare drops of water dripped from the ceiling, collecting in tiny puddles on the floor. Ancient people considered these caves sacred precisely because of the water, the only source of moisture in the dry canyon. The corridor branched off just beyond the entrance. Wet footprints on the stones pointed in the right direction. Max switched on the tactical mode of his torch and moved inside. The passage looped, narrowing so narrowly that he had to squeeze through sideways, then widening into small grottos with ceilings littered with stalactites. The ancient inhabitants had left their traces on the walls. Cave paintings depicted hunting scenes, prayers to the rain, and masked figures. After 200 meters of winding path, the cave suddenly widened, revealing an ancient sanctuary. The ceiling of the grotto was so high that the lantern beam could not reach it. In the middle stood a stone altar surrounded by rock-carved figures of Hopi gods. This place had existed long before white men first set foot on Arizona soil. It was the site of ceremonies that helped the Hopi people survive in the harsh desert environment for thousands of years. But now the ancient sanctuary was being desecrated by the modern descendants of the conquistadors. A camp lantern burned in the center of the grotto, illuminating 4 figures tied to stalagmites. John, Lisa, Emma, and Tyler Taylor were alive, but clearly dehydrated and frightened. The children were crying quietly, and that silent, childish anguish echoed in Max's soul, sharper than any physical pain. At the altar, with his back to Max, stood a tall man in hiking clothes. His hands were occupied with something he was retrieving from an ancient cache at the base of the altar. Even without seeing his face, Max recognized this figure, this manner of holding his shoulders. Jake Harris, the man who had once saved his life and now threatened the lives of 4 innocent people. Hide-and-seek time was over. Max stepped into the light, pointing the gun at his former mentor. "Step away from the altar, Jake," he said quietly, but his voice echoed through the cave. "Game over." The sandstorm in the Afghan desert reminded Max Wallace of the dusty whirlwinds of the Grand Canyon. The same blinding shroud that clung to every fold of his clothes. The same feeling of helplessness before the elements. Only here the sand was mixed with gunpowder, and the wind brought not the smell of pine trees, but the sound of distant gunfire. 9 years had passed since that day in Nankoweap Canyon. After the incident with Jake, Max had to flee Arizona, run away from himself. The Marine Corps promised a new beginning, a new identity, a structure, redemption. And now Lieutenant Wallace commanded a small Special Forces unit on a reconnaissance mission in the mountains of Afghanistan. "Lieutenant, there's a village up ahead." Intelligence says Abdul Hamid may be hiding there, Sergeant Miller reported, lowering his binoculars. Max assessed the situation. A small village of mud brick houses lurked in a rocky lowland. Several figures moved between the structures. Women, children? You couldn't tell at this distance. The team consisted of 6 men. Among them was Lance Corporal Ryan Edwards, a 22-year-old guy from Arizona who looked uncannily like Max himself when he was younger. The same stubborn determination in his gaze, the same rookie self-assurance. Sergeant Miller, you stay here with Peterson and provide cover. Me, Edwards, and Johnson will check out the village, Max ordered after a short deliberation. Edwards was first at the edge of the plateau. His movements were precise, measured, but they had the impatience of youth. Max knew that look, the same look he'd had before Nankoweap, before he'd learnt the true cost of a mistake. The descent took almost an hour. The village seemed lifeless, but experience told Max it was an illusion. In places like this, danger lurked in every shadow. The first shot rang out when they were 50 meters from the outermost house. A sniper. The bullet dug through the sand at Max's feet. The team spread out, taking up defensive positions. Edwards, go around to the right, check that eastern house, Max commanded, taking cover behind a stone ledge. Ryan nodded and ducked and moved along the shallow ravine. Max watched him tensely as he moved. Something was bothering him, some vague premonition. The sniper fell silent. Too suddenly, Sergeant Miller's excited voice crackled over the radio. "Lieutenant, I see movement in the flat-roofed house. Looks like a trap." The end of the phrase was drowned out by a deafening explosion. The eastern house Edwards was heading towards turned into a ball of fire. The shockwave threw Max to the ground, a ringing in his ears, sand in his mouth, and the realization that Ryan was only a few meters from the epicenter. Acting on pure instinct, Max rushed toward the blast site. Smoke stung his eyes, hot air burning his lungs. Ryan lay on his back with his arms spread. His chest and stomach were a bloody mess. But his eyes, young, full of life, were still staring. In them read a mute question to which Max had no answer. "Hang in there, kid. The medic will be here in a moment." Max tried to stop the bleeding, but realized the futility of his actions. There was too much blood, too much damage. At the last moment, Ryan grabbed his wrist with unexpected strength. His lips moved, but there was no sound. Max leaned closer. "Did I make it, sir?" was all Edwards asked before the light in his eyes faded. It was those words that haunted Max for the next 6 years. Not the explosions, not the gunfire, not the blood, but that simple question from the dying boy he'd sent straight into a trap. When Max returned to the States, it turned out that the house had been booby-trapped long ago. It was in the intelligence, but lost in the bureaucracy. The official investigation found no fault on the commander's part, but Max knew he should have foreseen, sensed the danger. He was more experienced. He should have listened to his instincts. Edwards was buried with honors. Max received a medal, and then an honorable discharge upon completion of his contract and a letter of recommendation to the National Park Service. And so, Max Wallace returned to the Grand Canyon, the site of his first fall. No longer as a thieving guide, but as a ranger, sworn to protect the place and its visitors. He'd run from Jake Harris, and now he'd met him again. He'd fled Ryan's death, but now he saw his face in every child in danger. The Taylors. They wouldn't be another one of his failures. This time he would do the right thing, even if he had to pay the ultimate price. Jake Harris turned around slowly, holding an ancient ceremonial object in his hands. The Kachina rain mask stared at Max with empty eye sockets. The dark wood, polished by the hands of dozens of generations of Hopi shamans, seemed alive in the uneven lantern light. "Maximilian Wallace," Jake said his name as if tasting a long-forgotten dish. 15 years! I've waited 15 years for this meeting." Max held the gun steady, not allowing his hand to waver. His gaze quickly assessed the situation. The Taylor family was emaciated, but alive. On the floor near the altar lay a tattered backpack with tools for retrieving artifacts. In the far corner of the cave were 3 water canisters and a radio. 2 more men lurked against the eastern wall, fighters with semi-automatic rifles, probably mercenaries. "Put the mask down, Jake. You know I won't let you take it away." Something resembling regret flashed in Jake's eyes. "And here I was really hoping you'd join me, Max. Just like old times. We were a good team, weren't we?" "That was before you started taking families with children hostage." Jake shrugged. "Cost of doing business. I had a contract. Find and deliver the mask by a certain date for $1.5 million. But then my guide reported that they'd installed motion sensors in the cave. The Park Service finally figured it out. They needed a smoke screen. A search and rescue operation would have distracted the rangers." Max felt a cold rage growing inside. Emma and Tyler were staring at him, eyes wide with desperate hope, like Ryan Edwards had once looked, dying in the sands of Afghanistan. "Let the hostages go, and we can work this out between us." Jake smiled. "Just like Afghanistan, right, Lieutenant? Only this time you're risking more than just one private, one wrong move, and 4 lives on your conscience." The space of the cave suddenly narrowed to a corridor between the two men. They were bound by the past, by blood and betrayal, like the day 15 years ago when Jake had risked himself to give Max a chance to escape. "I gave you the opportunity to choose back then, Max, remember? Make a choice of who you want to be. And you did. Left me to deal with Big Tony's mercenaries." Max remembered. That choice had haunted him for years. "I'm sorry, Jake. I was only 22. I was scared. And I got shot in the shoulder and 3 years in prison." Jake's eyes narrowed. "But I don't hold a grudge. After all, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have met my current employer in prison, a very influential collector. He's particularly interested in Hopi masks." Max realized that the conversation was coming to an end. Jake wouldn't give up. The mercenaries wouldn't miss that kind of money. In one smooth motion, he intercepted the weapon, aiming not at Jake, but at the stone vault above one of the mercenaries. There was a gunshot, then another. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the cave. The stalactites collapsed, burying one of the fighters underneath. Taking advantage of the second confusion, Max rolled to the ledge that provided him cover. The hostages were screaming. Jake whined, clutching his mask to his chest. The second mercenary fired indiscriminately, but his bullets only shot sparks out of the rocks. Max wasn't going to kill Jake, not after the man had once saved his life. But he couldn't let his family die. With another shot, this time at the camp lantern, he plunged the cave into darkness. Max moved unerringly in the darkness. He knew this cave like the back of his hand. 3 clear shots, and the second mercenary fell, wounded in the leg. Max was already beside the hostages, cutting their bonds with a tactical knife. "Get down and run for the exit," he commanded quietly to John Taylor, handing him a pocket torch. "Keep to the right wall." The flash of gunfire lit up Jake's face for a moment, contorted with rage, yet tinged with respect. He fired again, and Max felt a burning pain in his side. The bullet had gone off tangentially, but there was plenty of blood. "An eye for an eye, Max." Jake's voice came from just outside the main cell. "I'm taking the mask. You take the family. This time we're even." The silence that followed told me that Jake was gone. Max pressed his hand against the wound, feeling the blood seeping between his fingers. There was no time to chase. The priority was to save his family. Overcoming the pain, he led the Taylors out of the cave. Outside, a squad of rangers waited for them. Old Joe had called for reinforcements after all. The children were dehydrated, but the emergency doctors quickly stabilized their condition. Chief Ranger Jenkins approached Max as the medic was stitching up his wound. "A capture team intercepted your Jake Harris 5 kilometers from here. The mask is being returned to the Hopi tribe." Max nodded, feeling strangely relieved. "But there's a problem, Wallace. Harris said a lot of things while he was being held. About your past. About how you were a conduit for black diggers." Max knew this day would come. For 15 years, he'd lived in anticipation of payback. "I'll file my report tomorrow morning." Jenkins looked at Max for a long moment, then at the Taylor family, where little Tyler, wrapped in a rescue blanket, was waving to his rescuer. "I'm waiting for your report. But you know, the feds are asking us for a full briefing on the Nankoweap caves. All the trails, all the entrances. I think your expertise will be invaluable, no matter how you got it." Max looked up, not believing his ears. "You saved 4 lives today, Wallace. Maybe it's time to let go of the past and focus on the present." The sun was setting over the edge of the canyon, coloring the ancient cliffs a deep purple. where thousands of years ago masked shamans prayed for rain for their people, where Max Wallace had finally found his redemption. People are disappearing without a trace in White Sands. In the last 5 years, 27 people have disappeared here. Not everyone has been found. The gypsum dunes keep their secrets, and the proximity of the military training ground with its restricted areas gives rise to rumors of strange experiments and unseen dangers hidden in the glittering New Mexico desert. Logan Crowe, 35, a former Special Forces officer, now a park ranger, was preparing for his first solo patrol. He methodically checked his gear: 3 liters of water, a map of the area, a GPS unit with spare batteries, a walkie-talkie, a first aid kit, and flares. The route was designed to take 4 hours with a return by 17 o'clock, a standard park safety requirement. The White Sands posed a particular danger to visitors due to the monotonous landscape. The park's statistics for 2018 recorded 11 cases of missing tourists. 10 managed to be found within 48 hours. 1 person was never found. Temperatures in the dunes rose to plus 40 degrees C in July, and the sun's reflection off the gypsum sand increased the risk of dehydration and heat stroke. In the past, Logan served in Afghanistan, Helmand Province, where he was involved in special operations. During one mission in 2012, his squad was ambushed. 4 of his fellow soldiers were killed. After his discharge from the Army, Logan was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Working in an isolated park was his attempt to start a new life away from the triggers of war memories. On the 3rd day, Senior Ranger Sarah Lawrence briefed Logan on the features of the area. She paid particular attention to the eastern boundary of the park, beyond which was the White Sands military range. The range regularly tested missile technology, which sometimes required the temporary closure of part of the park to visitors. The boundary between the park and the range was marked by metal posts, but during sandstorms, these markers could be partially covered by sand. On the 22nd of July 2019, while returning from patrol, Logan noticed a red flag above the administration building, an alarm. The ranger on duty reported that the Gardner family from California, parents and 14-year-old daughter, had not returned from a scheduled dune hike by the scheduled time. Their car had been left in the car park, and the logbook had a note that the hike had started at 10:45 with a planned return by 4 p.m. Logan didn't yet know that these disappearances would be his first major test in his new position and would lead to unexpected revelations about both the park and his own past. The Gardner family's empty camp looked as if they had simply vanished. The tent stood untouched, with sleeping bags and personal belongings inside. The remnants of breakfast lay on a folding table, half-eaten tinned food, and half-empty water bottles. An open map with the marked route was pressed against a rock to keep it from flying away in the wind. An open diary and a pencil lay next to it, the last entry broken in mid-sentence. Logan Crowe discovered the Gardner camp on the 23rd of July at 8:20 a.m., 16 hours after the search operation began. He carefully recorded the location of all items and took photographs before touching anything. His attention was drawn to a diary entry from the previous day. Dad noticed something unusual behind the east dune. Looks like a metal structure. Going to check it out after. A search party was formed immediately after the alarm was sounded. 6 rangers, including Logan and Sarah Lawrence, split into pairs and set off in the 3 most likely directions. The ground search was supported by a helicopter that circled the area until darkness fell. In the morning, the search resumed, and Logan and Sarah headed for the furthest point of the Gardner's route marked on their map. Sarah scrutinized the compass that lay beside the map. "It's working fine," she noted. They couldn't have gotten lost because of broken equipment. Logan walked around the perimeter of the camp, studying the footprints in the sand. His trained eye spotted something that normal people wouldn't: 3 pairs of footprints heading in an easterly direction. The footprints were partially covered with sand, but still distinguishable. "They went that way," he pointed. "Towards the firing range." Sarah frowned. The range boundary was at least 5 kilometers from here. Why would they walk that far from the camp? Logan picked up the diary and showed her the entry. Something caught their attention. In the backpack of one of the missing men, Logan found a digital camera. Looking through the recent pictures, he saw a series of sunrise, dune, and family photos. The last was a blurry image of something metallic reflecting sunlight in the distance. Logan and Sarah moved along the Gardener's trail. After 2 kilometers, the tracks became less visible as the wind gradually erased them. After another kilometer, Sarah stopped, looking up at the sky. "We have to go back," she said, pointing to the southwest. The sandstorm was coming. A brown wall of wind-blown sand could be seen on the horizon. The day's weather forecast hadn't warned of a storm, but the weather changed rapidly in White Sands in the summer. Logan checked the GPS unit. The shelter on Route C was 2 kilometers to the northwest. We'd reach it in time. Shelters had been built at strategic points in the park just in case of sudden storms. Small concrete structures with water supplies and emergency equipment could save the lives of those caught in the storm. They had barely made it to the shelter when the first gusts of wind and sand caught up with them. Inside, the shelter was cramped but safe. Logan radioed the command center, reporting their location and the evidence they had found. The storm could last a few hours, Sarah warned, checking the supplies in the shelter. Maybe until morning. Logan nodded and went back to studying the evidence they'd found. Among the items in the Gardner camp, they had taken a camera, a diary, and personal documents to get a better idea of who they were dealing with. John Gardner, 42, is an electronics engineer from San Diego. Emily Gardner, 40, a biology teacher. Sophia Gardner, 14, a middle school student. Logan took a long look at Sophia's picture in the paperwork. Something familiar was in her facial features, in her smile, in the shape of her eyes. He was flipping through the family photos on his camera when he suddenly stopped. His hands trembled slightly. Sophia Gardner, laughing against the backdrop of White Sands, bore a striking resemblance to Layla, the sister of his friend Mike, who had died in Afghanistan. Same face shape, same expressive eyes, even a similar smile. Mike often showed pictures of his little sister, saying he was defending the country for its future. And then, in an instant, he was gone. Logan couldn't save his friend then, in the mountains of Helmand. Now he was faced with another task: to find the girl who looked so much like Layla. An old meteorologist from White Sands Park once told Logan, "Storms here don't just change the landscape, they change destinies." On the 23rd of July 2019, trapped in a concrete shelter in the middle of a sandstorm, Logan Crowe understood the meaning of those words. The elements outside weren't the only threat. Among his missing family's belongings, he discovered a clue that took the search to a whole new level. A sandstorm raged around the shelter where Logan and Sarah had been forced to wait out the weather. In the cramped space of the concrete shelter, they were organizing the items they had found at the Gardner camp. Their hands casually touched as they simultaneously reached for the camera. Sarah held her gaze on Logan for a moment, and then quickly averted her eyes. In the confined space of the shelter, Logan felt her presence more acutely. The subtle scent of her shampoo, the measured breathing, the professional concentration with which she studied the evidence. In the 3 weeks he'd been working in the park, he'd begun to notice the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear in moments of thoughtfulness, the way her voice changed when she talked about things that really mattered to her. Now that they were cut off from the rest of the world, those details seemed especially meaningful. Logan couldn't take his eyes off the picture of Sophia Gardner. Every time he looked at her smile, the face of Layla, his dead comrade's sister, came to mind. John Gardner's backpack contained a professional compass, binoculars, and a map of the region, with marked coordinates in the eastern part of the park. Logan found in a small waterproof pouch the business card of Lieutenant Colonel David Hammond, an environmental control officer at White Sands Proving Ground. On the back was a handwritten note, 11 o'clock, Zone S16. "Sarah, take a look at this." Logan showed her the find. Gardner was planning a meeting with the military. Why did they go as a family? And why didn't they put it on the itinerary? Logan went back to studying the family's papers. John Gardner worked for a company that made environmental monitoring equipment. Emily was an ecology professor at UCLA. Their professional interest in the park was becoming more apparent. In Sophia's backpack, Logan found a personal diary. The last entries shed light on the purpose of their trip. Dad argued with Mom again about the trip. She doesn't think I should go with them, but he insists it's an educational experience. They're going to take soil samples for research as part of Dad's environmental monitoring project. Tomorrow we're going to the east side of the park. By the morning of the 24th of July, the storm had abated. Logan woke up to the fact that the small shelter was noticeably quieter. Sarah was asleep, leaning against his shoulder. In the tightness of the night, they were unwittingly closer to each other than their working relationship had suggested. Logan reached for his binoculars carefully, trying not to wake her. Sarah opened her eyes, catching his gaze in the semi-darkness of the bunker. For a moment there was a silent understanding between them, more than professional solidarity. Then the moment passed, and they returned to the reality of the search operation. When they got out of cover, the landscape around them had changed completely. All the tracks they had been tracking had been obliterated by the storm. Communication with the command center was restored, and the first order they received startled Logan. All search teams were forbidden to approach the eastern sector of the park, where the missing men were believed to be. The military range announced that missile tests would begin in 72 hours. Back at headquarters, Logan checked Sophia's belongings and found an asthma inhaler marked for use every 12 hours. Without that medication, she was in grave danger in the desert conditions. The ranger contacted Lieutenant Colonel Hammond. After several redirects, he was able to speak to the officer. Gardner applied to us for permission to conduct an environmental study, Hammond reluctantly admitted. But no official authorization had been granted. If they crossed the boundary of the range, that's a serious offense. There could be civilians on the range, including a child with asthma, Logan insisted. The tests need to be postponed. The test schedule has been approved at the highest level. There can be no changes. After this conversation, Logan met with Frank Wilcox, an old meteorologist who had worked at the park for more than 30 years. Area S16? Frank frowned. That's the old observation area, closed in the 80s. There were observation bunkers there to record the results of early tests. Some of them are still standing. Frank pulled out an old map and pointed to a point in the eastern sector. If they were looking for this area and got caught in the storm, there's a chance they took shelter in one of the bunkers. But the area is considered potentially dangerous because of residual contamination. Logan noted the coordinates. At that moment, a call from Sarah came over the radio. She had intercepted a military transmission. In 48 hours, the eastern sector would be completely cleared of personnel before testing. The military had effectively abandoned the search of their territory, writing the family off. And official channels demanded time, which the Gardners no longer had. Logan made a decision. He had to act immediately, alone, without support or official authorization. The night patrol passed only 10 meters from Logan. He lay motionless, huddled in the sand, as he had once been in the mountains of Afghanistan. The next patrol was due in 30 minutes. In that time, he had to find the entrance to the S16 bunker, where, according to Frank's coordinates, the Gardner family could be hiding. It was his last hope of finding Sophia alive. Logan began preparations immediately after talking to the old meteorologist. He planned to act alone, not wanting to put anyone at risk. At 9:40 p.m., the ranger left the park's administration building and headed for the service jeep, loading the necessary gear: a map, GPS unit, night vision device from his army kit, a supply of water, a first aid kit with asthma medication, and flares. Sarah's sudden appearance changed his plans. Standing in the shadows, she easily guessed his intentions. Logan's attempts to dissuade his colleague from taking part in the risky operation were futile. Sarah reminded him that she had spent 10 years in White Sands and knew the eastern sector much better than Logan. There was an undeniable logic in those words that made him agree to the joint foray. Together, they crossed the official park boundary in an unmarked jeep. For camouflage, they traveled without headlights, relying on night vision devices. Beyond the tourist routes, the dunes became higher and more dangerous, some as high as 10 meters, with steep slopes that trapped many inexperienced travelers. When they reached the perimeter of the military range, they camouflaged the jeep between two dunes and continued on foot. Logan couldn't help noting how confidently Sarah navigated the night desert. Her professionalism was truly admirable. They spotted the first military patrol at 0:15. Two soldiers with night vision devices methodically surveyed the area. The Rangers lay down behind a dune, remaining perfectly still until the patrol was out of sight. According to Frank's map, the S-16 bunker was 3 kilometers from the perimeter. Moving from cover to cover, Logan and Sarah slowly made their way deeper into the restricted area. They passed an abandoned observation tower partially covered with sand, presumably the one the gardeners had spotted before they disappeared. As they descended the steep dune slope to the bunker's intended location, Sarah suddenly lost her balance on the crumbling sand. Logan instinctively grabbed her arm, preventing her from falling, and a moment later their eyes met in the semi-darkness. A silent understanding between them, something deeper and more personal than just a relationship between colleagues. In a low spot between the dunes, the Rangers found a metal door almost completely hidden by sand. Clearing the entrance, they worked together to move the rusted hinges. It looked like the room had once served as an observation point for recording test results. Logan noticed fresh footprints on the dusty floor leading to the interior, clear evidence of recent human presence. Following the branching corridors, the Rangers found a bracelet with a dolphin pendant, just like the one in Sophia Gardner's photograph. In one of the side rooms, they finally found the entire Gardner family. John was sitting against the wall, supporting his wife's head, which was resting on his jacket. Sophia, visibly weakened, was clutching an empty inhaler in her hands. Seeing the Rangers, hope flashed in the girl's eyes. Logan's brief introduction was interrupted by the appearance of 2 armed military men in the doorway. The situation instantly escalated. Not only had the Rangers violated the boundary of the restricted area, but they had been caught by a military patrol. With exceptional composure, Sarah managed to turn the military's attention to the medical emergency. She clearly identified the asthmatic girl's condition and Emily Gardner's signs of dehydration. After a brief conference with command over the radio, the military was ordered to evacuate the entire group to the base's medical center. Military jeeps transported the rescued and rescuers to a waiting medical helicopter. Sophia received the necessary treatment immediately, and her parents also received expert care. Logan and Sarah expected serious consequences for unauthorized entry into the military facility. Instead of arrest, however, they were met with Colonel Hammond. The officer was blunt about the seriousness of the violation of federal law, but then suddenly softened his tone. He explained that John Gardner, a well-known environmental monitor, had repeatedly requested permission to explore the eastern sector. Although he had been officially denied, some of the range staff had taken an informal interest in his work, which explained the presence of Hammond's business card with notes about the meeting. The colonel said he expected a professional tour for one specialist, not a family outing with a child. A sandstorm that began cut off communications, and the family took refuge in a bunker, not even realizing the range had been breached. Hammond confirmed that the planned tests would go ahead as scheduled, but the S-16 area was out of range, so the Gardners were in no immediate danger. The colonel made it clear that Logan and Sarah had never officially crossed the range, and that the discovery of the Gardner family had been the result of the military rescue team's quick actions. In his eyes, however, he was genuinely grateful for their initiative. On the 25th of July, returning to the park, the Rangers were reprimanded by their superiors for unauthorized night travel outside the duty route. However, the severity of the administrative penalty was mitigated by the unofficial approval of their superiors, who understood the true value of saving a family of hikers. By the evening of the same day, Sophia Gardner's condition had significantly improved. On the phone from Alamogordo Hospital, the girl personally thanked her rescuers. For Logan, this conversation was a turning point. For the first time in a long time, the image of Layla, the sister of the dead comrade, began to fade, giving way to the living voice of the rescued Sophia. At sunset, Logan and Sarah stood on the observation deck, watching the last rays of sunlight color the white dunes with golden and pink tones. There was that special silence between them that is more eloquent than any words. In quiet conversation, Logan shared that he chose to work in white sands, hoping that this white landscape would help him forget the brown sands of Afghanistan. Ironically, it was here, in a place so unlike the fields of his combat service, that he finally had to come face to face with the memories he had been trying to escape. Sarah didn't need to ask about his future plans. The answer was in the calm expression on Logan's face. For the first time in years, he was ready to let go of his past and move on. When the ground beneath them shuddered slightly from the testing that had begun at the range, Logan didn't flinch as he usually did. Instead, he smiled, easily and freely, like a man who had finally found his place in the world. The white sands are changing. That is their nature. A lot has happened in the park over the year. In December 2019, the U.S. Congress officially upgraded the status of the area to White Sands National Park. The number of visitors nearly doubled, requiring the hiring of additional rangers. Logan Crowe stayed on to work at the park, being promoted to senior security ranger. His SWAT experience combined with his natural powers of observation made him indispensable. PTSD attacks became much less frequent. Sometimes weeks would pass without a single disturbing memory. Sarah Lawrence led a new environmental monitoring program in collaboration with the University of California. John and Emily Gardner became the project's first consultants. Sometimes after work, Logan and Sarah would watch sunsets together from the observation deck. Colleagues had long noticed that their relationship had outgrown professional boundaries. In July 2020, exactly 1 year after the events in the eastern sector, Logan received a parcel from San Diego. Sophia Gardner had sent her school paper about desert conservation, which had received the highest grade. Attached to the paper was a photograph, Logan and Sarah in ranger uniforms against a backdrop of snow-white dunes, and a short note. "Thank you for showing that even in the desert you can find your way home." That evening, holding the photograph and standing on the observation deck, Logan finally realized that his long journey across the sands was over. He had indeed found his way home. On the 19th of May 1999, Juan Menddees heard a scream in the canyon, and it changed everything. Juan Menddees knew every bend of the Rio Grande River in Big Bend National Park better than the lines on his own palm. He was 27 in the spring of 1999, and his 7th year as a ranger in this rugged corner of Texas had already left the first wrinkles on his face, as deep and unpredictable as the canyons he patrolled. Every morning as he put on his wide-brimmed uniform hat, Juan thought back to the day that changed his life forever. He was 12 when he sat on the banks of the Rio Grande all night, waiting for his uncle and cousins to cross the border. They never came. A week later, the Border Patrol found their bodies in the desert, off the beaten path without water, under the merciless Texas sun. Juan's parents had crossed the border legally 10 years earlier, thanks to luck and the right paperwork. His family was lucky, others were not. This simple truth became the foundation of his life. Big Bend did not forgive mistakes. The majestic park of over 1,000 square kilometers was a dangerous maze of hot deserts, sheer cliffs, and winding canyons. Temperatures soared to 49 degrees during the day and dropped below zero at night. Dangerous predators, poisonous plants, treacherous trails, deceptive mirages, and that's not counting people with bad intentions, for whom the wilderness was the perfect hiding place. The old rangers said the canyon kept some secrets for decades, but sometimes the river rises and brings them to the surface. Bones, weapons, lost things. Stories long buried beneath sand and oblivion. Juan believed his job was not just to preserve nature, but also to protect people seeking a better life from the risks of this harsh land. In the spring of 1999, Juan Menddees did not yet know that his familiar park hid dark secrets that would change his life forever, and that some of the discoveries he would make in the depths of Santa Elena Canyon would be better left buried beneath the sand of the Chihuahua Desert. What Juan Menddees found in Santa Elena Canyon on the 19th of May, 1999 was no accident. He would later realize that the ancient Aztec symbol and the traces of blood in the sand were the beginning of a chain of events that risked costing the lives of many people, including himself. Juan began his patrol at 5:30 a.m., when the first rays of sunlight had just painted the eastern edge of the desert a golden color. At this time of year, the temperature was rapidly rising from a comfortable morning 18 degrees to a sizzling afternoon 40. He scheduled radio conversations with the other rangers for 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. unless there was an emergency. Juan's equipment was honed by years of experience. 4 liters of water in special thermal containers were attached to his belt and rucksack, ensuring access even when traveling on narrow trails. A GPS unit, a relatively new acquisition by the Park Service, complemented the traditional topographic map, protected in a waterproof case. Binoculars, first aid kit, spare batteries for the radio, sunscreen, compass, signal lantern, matches in a sealed pack, a knife, a light snack of dried meat and nuts. Everything had its place and purpose. The route for the day included the eastern portion of Santa Elena Canyon, one of the 3 main canyons in the park. Vertical limestone walls up to 500 meters high created an impressive corridor for the Rio Grande River, which here became the border between the USA and Mexico. Officially, Juan was checking the condition of the hiking trails and observing animals after a recent period of rain. By 7 o'clock, the sun was already blazing, and the silence was broken only by the rustling of the desert dwellers and the rare cries of hawks soaring over the canyon. Juan methodically checked the marks on the map. A herd of forked antelope grazed at a safe distance from the trail. The tracks of a desert badger crossed his route. In a rocky ravine, he spotted fresh rattlesnake tracks and made a note in his notebook to warn hiking groups. At 8:40, Juan reached a point where the trail descended to one of the few accessible shoals in the river. This spot was 4 kilometers from the nearest official crossing point. The ranger's experienced eye immediately spotted an anomaly. Fresh footprints in the sand leading to a narrow crevice in the rock where tourists did not normally enter. This part of the canyon was not marked in the guidebooks, and most park visitors were unaware of its existence. Following his hunting instinct, developed through years of work, Juan moved cautiously along the tracks. The shoe prints belonged to at least 3 different people, and one of them, judging by the depth of the tracks, was carrying something heavy. Something or someone. The crevice was wider than it looked from the outside and went about 20 meters deep into the rock, forming a small grotto. Here, among the rocks, Juan found clear signs of recent human occupancy. The remains of a campfire, wrappers from energy bars with American labels, and several empty water bottles. But the most disturbing findings were the dark stains on the sand that looked like dried blood, and a scrap of cloth stuck between the rocks. As he examined the site more carefully, Juan noticed a glint of metal in the sand. When he picked it up, he was surprised to find that he was holding an Aztec cross of Quetzalcoatl, a small silver pendant with a skull in the center and snake motifs around the edges. Juan immediately recalled his mother's stories about ancient Aztec symbols and their meaning. Such crosses, she said, were worn as amulets, especially when going on dangerous journeys. Suddenly, Juan felt someone's eyes on him. The ranger's instincts kicked in instantly as he slowly lowered his hand to his holster and turned cautiously toward the exit of the grotto. The sunlight streaming through the crevice was blinding his eyes, but he was sure he saw movement at the entrance. From the depths of the canyon came a sound like a muffled human cry, or was it the cry of a bird? In the acoustically complex environment of the canyons, sounds were often distorted, deceiving even experienced rangers. Juan made the decision to check. Clutching the grip of his pistol tighter, he moved cautiously toward the exit of the grotto. At that moment, 3 figures appeared in the crevice, 2 men with automatic rifles and a third, apparently their guide, with a machete on his belt. Everyone's reaction was the same, a momentary freeze at the sight of each other. Juan introduced himself as a National Park Ranger. The older of the men said something quickly to the others in Spanish, too quietly for Juan to hear. Then, ignoring the demand to stop, all three turned and disappeared around the corner of the canyon. It was against Ranger Service security protocol to pursue armed men alone, and Juan, after a second's hesitation, chose to follow instructions. Back at the base by 4:30 p.m., Juan compiled a detailed report on the incident, including the coordinates of the grotto and a description of the suspicious persons. His immediate superior, Chief Ranger Thomas Davis, viewed the report with his usual skepticism. In response to Juan's concerns, Davis merely shrugged. Just another group of illegals using the park as a transit point. As for the blood and the strange screaming, not much happens at the border. Someone in the group must have hurt themselves while crossing. The Border Patrol has been notified, but further investigation is unlikely to follow. That evening, back in his small house on the outskirts of Terlingua, Juan took a long look at the cross he had found. His mother had told him that the Aztecs believed that such symbols protected the owner on his journey to the afterlife. The cross with the skull was especially valued because it combined the symbols of life and death, reminding him of the thin line between the two. Determined to preserve his find, Juan hid the cross in a wooden box where he kept the few family heirlooms. The next morning, the 20th of May, 1999, began with disturbing news. A ranger dispatcher reported that a young couple of hikers from Austin had not returned from a day hike in the Santa Elena Canyon area. Their SUV was found parked at the start of the hiking trail, just a kilometer from the crevasse where Juan had met the gunman. On the 15th of March 2002, the heaviest downpour in a decade hit Big Bend. The water eroded the sandy slope in Santa Elena Canyon and brought with it not only mud and rocks, but also a secret that Juan Menddees had been trying to solve for 3 long years, a secret for which people paid with their lives. Since the terrorist attacks of the 11th of September 2001, the border with Mexico has become a high-profile area. The number of border patrols doubled and document checks became more thorough. Juan never forgot about the missing tourists and the Aztec cross. For 3 years, he continued his quiet investigation unnoticed by his superiors. The Austin couple was never found, and search operations were curtailed 2 weeks after their disappearance. Too few resources for too much territory. The official reports read, "Presumed dead from dehydration after straying from the marked trail." But Juan knew that on that day, the tracks in the sand had led in a very different direction. Patrolling the canyon after a rainstorm wasn't part of his job description, but Juan volunteered to check the condition of the hiking trails before the park's scheduled reopening. The rivers and streams in Big Bend had a character all their own. They could remain parched for years and then turn into deadly torrents in a matter of hours. This downpour changed the topography of the canyon's eastern slope, collapsing an entire layer of limestone and exposing what had been hidden from human eyes for years. Half a mile from the unfortunate crevice where he had found the cross, Juan discovered a hiding place. In a small natural cave that had been washed out by a recent flood, there were rucksacks, shoes, clothes, small personal items, all the things people usually take with them on a long journey. Methodically examining each item, Juan suddenly froze. A small toy, a plush jaguar with one glass eye, had fallen out of the half-destroyed rucksack. It was exactly the same toy his cousin Ramon had had when he'd traveled across the desert with his father in 1984. A prickle rose in the ranger's throat as he picked up the worn toy, covered with sand and shells that the water had brought from the riverbank. Most of the items did not belong to Americans. The inscriptions on the items were in Spanish, and poorly preserved Mexican ID cards were found among the documents. This might have confirmed the superior's version of mere illegals, if not for another find, an expensive camera and a drawing tablet with the initials LK, the same initials as the missing Austin tourist, Laura Klein. Juan carefully gathered all the documents and small items that could serve as evidence. They confirmed what he had suspected all along. There was a connection between the disappearance of the tourists and the groups crossing the border. Juan did not go to his superiors with his findings. Instead, he went to the small town of Mexican side of the border. There, in a dilapidated shack on the outskirts, lived his old friend Miguel Santos. A former guide for American explorers, Miguel knew these places as well as Juan, and had connections on. Sitting on the old porch overlooking the distant cliffs of Big Bend, Miguel took a long look at Juan's findings. Then he told what the ranger was already beginning to suspect. There were villages of people who had entered the desert but never returned from it. At least 10 families from surrounding communities had lost relatives trying to cross the border through Santa Elena Canyon in the past 3 years. Contact with the same group of guides who promised a safe crossing. The locals called it the ghosts of the canyon. They said the desert took those who didn't respect its ancient laws. But Miguel, who had grown up in the midst of these superstitions, had long suspected that it was not a matter of curses. The guides who charged desperate people the last of their money were probably connected to the drug cartels that used the routes through the park. Who could guarantee that the migrants weren't simply eliminated so they couldn't tell about the secret trails? And the tourists? They could have been accidental witnesses. Or, Miguel pondered, they could have been taken hostage for ransom. The Americans traveling through the park were often from wealthy families. Back on the American side with the new information, Juan tried to interest his superior. Thomas Davis's reaction was predictable. "Don't make a fuss about illegals, Menddees. We have enough problems as it is. After last year's terrorist attack, the feds are digging their noses into the ground looking for terrorists at every turn. You think anyone cares about missing Mexicans?" Juan remained silent, staring at the picture of the missing American couple still hanging on the notice board in the ranger's office. They cared. Their families cared. These people deserved justice no matter which side of the border they were born on. Juan spent the next 2 months in the Terlingua archives, studying old maps and geological reports about Big Bend. In the 1930s, there were several mercury mines in the area, most of which had closed by the 1950s due to depletion and dangerous conditions for workers. Many were flooded when an artificial lake was created after a dam was built upstream of the Rio Grande. In the archives of the mining department, Juan found a map of the Esperanza mine, which officially closed in 1943. The yellowed sheet marked an unknown tunnel leading toward Santa Elena Canyon, a tunnel not mentioned in any contemporary report. According to the notes in the margin, it had been mothballed because of the instability of the rock, and the entrance had been capped, but there was a handwritten note on the map that said access possible through the northeast drift during the dry season. Looking at the map showing the tunnel, Juan felt the pieces of the puzzle begin to come together. If the entrance to the mine was near a shallow part of the river, it could indeed become accessible during a drought, a perfect place to hide. The perfect place to hide people so that no one would ever find them. As he was about to leave the archive, Juan noticed an entry in the visitor's log. Only a month ago, the same documents had been requested by one R. Cortez, a name Miguel had mentioned as one of the guides linked to the migrant disappearances. The puzzle was getting more and more sinister, but Juan knew he needed more evidence before he could act. In the meantime, he had to wait for the right moment. Perhaps the next dry season would reveal the secrets the Rio Grande had been hiding. The 2006 drought exposed more than just the hidden rocks of the Rio Grande. It also exposed the secrets Juan Menddees had been chasing for 7 years. When the river level dropped to a historic low, the ranger realized it was his last chance to stop what was happening in the Santa Elena Canyon dungeons before the river rose again and hid the truth forever. By this time, Juan had risen to chief ranger, replacing the retiring Thomas Davis. The authority of the new position gave more latitude, but also increased responsibility for other rangers and park visitors. In early May, the station received a report from a Mexican shepherd. While gathering goats on his side of the border, he discovered a metal structure protruding from a shallow stream, looking like a mine entrance with signs of recent activity. Juan immediately linked it to a map of the Esperanza mine he'd found in the archives 4 years ago. The water level had finally dropped enough to expose what had been hidden for decades beneath the flow of the Rio Grande. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he assembled a group of 4 rangers under the pretext of a geological expedition. Official cover was necessary. If suspicions were confirmed, they would be facing an organized crime group, not ordinary border crossers. On the 21st of May 2006, exactly 7 years after that unfortunate discovery, Juan's group went to the entrance. As they descended the steep slope, they saw a metal airlock, almost invisible from the outside, but clearly recently used. The hinges were not rusted through, and the sand showed signs of multiple movements. After opening the airlock, the group found themselves in front of a narrow tunnel going deep into the rock. The wall bracing system indicated that the 1930s construction had been greatly reinforced with modern materials. Moving through the tunnel by lantern light, the Rangers walked about 300 meters before reaching a spacious hall that had once served as the central shaft. What they found inside exceeded Juan's darkest expectations. Along the walls stretched metal cages reminiscent of prison cells. Inside and out lay sleeping bags, leftover food, empty bottles. In the corner was a diesel generator, and nearby were handcuffs attached to rock ledges. At the far end of the cave, they found a radio station and journals, with handwritten lists of names and amounts, as well as several cassette recorders for recording messages from captives. It was obvious that people had left the place in a hurry. There was unfinished food and open water bottles on the table. Probably after news of the shepherd's discovery began to spread among the locals, one of the rangers discovered a folder of documents. It contained lists of names with amounts ranging from $5,000 to $30,000. Some names were crossed out, others were marked paid or transported. Among the papers were copies of American passports for several people, including a missing couple from Austin, and Mexican documents. In a far section of the cave, Juan came across video equipment with a camera pointed at a wood-paneled wall with a notch for a human head, a setup for recording proof of life when ransom was demanded. The radio suddenly crackled. A patrol boat was reporting suspicious movement. Several vehicles were heading toward the mine on the Mexican side. Juan ordered the group to gather all documents and return immediately. As they made their way out through the tunnel, the group heard voices approaching. Juan decided to turn down a side corridor that, according to the map, led to an exit in Santa Elena Canyon. Moving through narrow passages in places flooded with groundwater, the Rangers came to an abandoned mine shaft. Climbing rusty ladders, they found themselves in the same crevice where Juan had found the Aztec cross 7 years ago. The circle had closed. 3 armed men were waiting for them at the exit of the cleft. Among them, Juan recognized R. Cortez, whose name he had seen in the archive journal 4 years before. The tense confrontation lasted several minutes. Cortez offered a deal. The Rangers leave with the documents, and he and his men disappear. Otherwise, it would be known that Juan had conducted the operation without consulting the authorities. Juan realized that Cortez was bluffing for fear of kidnapping charges, but the criminal's confidence spoke volumes about his law enforcement connections. Juan declined the offer and demanded that they lay down their weapons. Cortez drew his gun. In a brief gunfight, one of his men was wounded, and the ringleader and the third raider tried to escape. The 2 Rangers stayed behind to treat the wounded man while Juan and his partner pursued the fugitives. The chase led to a hidden grotto on the riverbank. Cortez was wounded and apprehended, and his accomplice drowned while trying to swim across the Rio Grande. In the grotto, Rangers found 6 migrants, including 2 children, handcuffed together. One of the boys, frightened and exhausted, clutched in his hand an Aztec cross depicting a skull, similar to the one Juan had found 7 years earlier. As the hostages received medical attention, a grim picture finally emerged. Cortez and his gang had been using the tunnels to smuggle drugs for years. Over time, they switched to a more lucrative business, luring migrants with promises of safe border crossings, then kidnapping them for ransom or forcing them to work for the cartels. Casual witnesses, like tourists from Austin, were also victimized. Juan was faced with a choice: turn the case over to a federal agency, risking a backlash because of powerful connections, or bring justice on his own. Looking at the survivors, especially the boy with the Aztec cross, Juan made a choice. Justice should have no boundaries, just as the desert, whose guardian he had always considered himself, had no boundaries. In the spring of 2007, the level of the Rio Grande returned to normal, and the waters once again hid the entrance to the abandoned Esperanza mine. It was as if nature had erased the traces of human crime, but the memory of it lived on. The federal investigation lasted nearly 9 months. Cortez received a life sentence. 3 local officials involved in the scheme awaited trial. Thanks to the evidence Juan collected, authorities were able to identify more than 30 victims who had gone missing over the past 7 years. The names of 17 of them are forever inscribed on a stone memorial plaque at the entrance to Santa Elena Canyon. The families of a missing Austin couple finally have answers, though not the answers they hoped for. Their bodies were discovered in one of the mine's abandoned drifts during a clearing operation. Juan often visited the rescued boy with the Aztec cross. During the search for his relatives, it turned out that his parents had died trying to cross the border. In October 2007, after months of paperwork, Juan became the official guardian of 8-year-old Miguel. Ranger Menddees now conducted training sessions for new park employees, teaching them not only how to read animal tracks, but also signs of human activity in the desert. "The frontier is not a line on the ground," he said. "It's a fine line between law and lawlessness, between life and death, and it's our job to be the guardians of that boundary." One warm evening in late November, Juan and Miguel patrolled the banks of the Rio Grande on horseback as the old ranger taught the new generation to respect and understand the desert. The boy gently clutched the Aztec cross in his hand, no longer a symbol of fear, but a reminder of survival. The sun was slowly setting over the horizon, coloring the canyons of Big Bend red. To the casual observer, it was just 2 riders against a majestic landscape. But for Juan, the moment meant more than that. The circle had closed, and the story that began with loss had ended with gain. Friends, you've just heard the story of the Big Bend Ranger who uncovered the dark secrets of Santa Elena Canyon. But how many similar mines and tunnels remain undiscovered on our border? Have all the victims really been found, or are some still missing? How many more victims do the secret corners of Big Bend hide? Share your thoughts in the comments. If the story impressed you as much as it did me, support the channel by liking and subscribing. More mysterious stories from other national parks in America are waiting for us in the next issues. See you soon. And now our stories are dissolving into silence. Each of them is not just an episode from the past, but a mirror in which we see how ghostly is the line between duty and fear, between chance and conscious choice of fate. There are still more questions than answers. But perhaps it is in this unspokenness that the true essence of existence lies, in the eternal search, in the anxious expectation, in the unquenchable thirst to understand the incomprehensible. Which of the stories touched the strings of your soul? Share it in the comments, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more mysteries waiting to be revealed.